Thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture by Dr. Victoria Fast, Who's Responsible for Social Justice in the Smart City? My name is Jim Ellis, and I'm the director of the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. I'm delighted to welcome you to this talk, which will engage with differing visions of the city, quite fortuitously timed, I would say, just days before our own municipal election, when very stark competing visions of the city, I think, characterize the two frontrunners at the moment. This is the first in our series of Fellows Lectures for the 2021-2022 academic year. Each year, the CIH hosts an accomplished multidisciplinary group of fellows who are given time and space to pursue research in the company of a highly engaging community of scholars. At the end of their tenure, fellows are asked to give a lecture on the research they conducted while in residence. Tonight's talk deals with the nature of cities, and in particular, the rise of the smart city. Cities that through data collection, surveillance, and monitoring of various kinds have the ability to respond to real-time information, becoming more resilient and more livable, or at least this is the promise. Dr. Fast's research explores how these cities might be responsive and accommodating to some inhabitants more than others, based on such things as ability, economic status, or gender. Every city is an evolving and at times contested space, where older and newer versions of the city clash or coincide. And I would like to acknowledge at this point earlier versions of this city, previously called Mobilities. The city and the University of Calgary are located on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, including the Siksika, the Tsuut'ina, the Piikani, the Kainai, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. Mobilities is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And if you would like to learn more about the history of the Métis people in Calgary, I would highly recommend the new exhibit at Fort Calgary, excuse me. And because tonight's talk is about cities, I do also want to plug the Calgary Institute for the Humanities Calgary Atlas project, which you may have seen slides of just prior to this. This project seeks to map alternative or lesser known histories of the city to explore the city's rich and diverse history, including such things as First Nations participation in the Calgary Stampede. And just recently, two new maps have come out, one exploring Calgary's labor history, the other exploring Calgary's lost cinemas. All of these maps are available at Calgary's fine independent bookstores, such as Shelf Life and Pages and Owl's Nest. Or you can write to us at the CIH to get more information. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Victoria Fast, who is an associate professor in the Department of Geography here at the University of Calgary and a longtime member of the CIH's interdisciplinary working group, which explores social justice and the smart city. Dr. Fast's field of research is broadly urban GIS, GIS meaning Geographic Information System Mapping. And urban GIS is an interdisciplinary mix of geographic information science, human geography, and urban studies. Dr. Fast's work draws on specialized knowledge of spatial and open data, on smart cities, on spatial analysis and modeling, participatory GIS, and volunteer geographic information. She brings all of these together to study and advocate for urban and pedestrian environments that are vibrant, safe, and inclusive. This includes mapping, modeling, and analyzing, looking at such things as sidewalk conditions, urban and building accessibility, urban density, pedestrian collisions, accessible mobility, and active transit. Dr. Fast's research program is driven by the goal of ensuring that all individuals have just and sustainable access to the built as well as digital environments, unrestricted by social, economic, and cultural forces. For tonight's talk, Professor Fast will be drawing on scholarship first explored in the CIH working group on social justice in the smart city, which she then carried through into her CIH fellowship year, which was last year. And further now into an edited collection of essays with co-editors Dr. Deborah McKinnon and Dr. Ryan Burns. This collection of essays is currently under contract and under review with the University of Toronto Press, and we look forward to seeing that book come out perhaps next year. Now, there will be time for questions at the end of the talk, so please do put them in the Q&A section, which you can open by hitting the button at the bottom of your screen, and I will relay them to Dr. Fast at the end of her talk. It's now my great pleasure to give to you Dr. Victoria Fast.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Dr. Ellis. I'm really happy to be here and happy to explore this research. As you shared, my research has been very technical, and so it was really fun to make space to understand the implications of smart cities and smart city research, especially the implications on social justice. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 people in the region of Southern Alberta. And so what I'll be talking about today to start is who is responsible, obviously, for social justice in the smart city. And that will start by defining smart cities and the lineage of this research, because it's 5 years in the making. And then I'll explore social justice and ponder injustice, and I'll investigate who's responsible. And then I'll present the ongoing research in the volume on digital injustice in the smart city. Okay, so to start, first defining smart cities. So a smart city uses data and connected to technology to provide services to solve urban problems. So common examples of this include smart home thermostats, parking apps rather than having a parking meter. And it's not just about the improvement in technology, it's about the connectedness of that technology. So for example, I'm showing a traditional hand dryer here that's really not efficient, and then the evolution of hand dryers that dry our hands a lot better. But it's not smart, or at least this iteration of these Dyson dryers are not smart. Whereas the development of advanced of water fountains here, where we can see it's a metered fountain, is smart because there's a flow of data. So it tracks the number of refills and water usage, which can be used as information to determine when the water filter needs to be replaced, or where high-use fountains are located that could have more frequent cleaning. So returning to the hand dryer example, then, how could the hand dryer be smart? And so perhaps the evolution of hand dryers, it's possible that one day they can scan to detect the presence of lingering bacteria and viruses on our hands after washing. And then these data can be helpful in determining where germs hide on our hands after washing, so public health can target better hand washing outreach. They can detect high viral load in the air and potentially shut down the washroom for deep cleaning. Or maybe in the more dystopian reality, they'll determine who's using the washroom since the viral load was spiking, and using smart ID cards force them to isolate for 2 weeks. And so again, the key bit of smart city technology is the data and the connected technologies that are part of that. And so as a geographic information scientist, these data streams are helpful for scholars like me, especially if they're open data, as I use smart cities to study, for example, how people move around cities and pedestrian mobilities via sidewalk width, pedestrian collision, and active transit networks. So when I started at the University of Calgary 5 years ago now, I was invited to join an interdisciplinary urban studies research group funded through the Vice President of Research Office. It was led by Dr. Byron Miller in geography. And here I got to explore the social and environmental implications of smart cities. So it presented a chance to reflect and to study the implications of the technology and the data that I was already working on. And it's a great interdisciplinary group comprised of faculty and students from across the campus, including arts, business, School of Landscape Planning and Architecture, and in addition to global and local partners. That has since evolved. The Global Urban Research at the University of Calgary has now been rebranded as UC Cities. Thank you so much to my research associate, Mariah Wilson, who created this awesome logo for us. And by the way, the QR code here, you can scan that with your phone's camera and it'll bring you directly to the UC Cities webpage. So I've integrated these QR codes throughout the presentation to link to resources and literature as it's relevant to my talk tonight. And so this work established 5 key comparative themes for smart city work. So first, the diffusion and adaptation of the smart city, where we asked, where do smart city ideas come from? How does the idea of smart city change as it travels? How do local actors adapt and theorize smart cities for local cultures and institutions? And then what is their impact comparing across cities and across different kinds of initiatives? The next theme that we looked at is governance. So how do smart city initiatives reshape urban political authority within cities and across multi-level and regional contexts? And how does this form of urban and metropolitan government impact the deployment of smart city approaches? And now this is the theme that I was most involved in and most interested in, is social justice and participation in the smart city, where we ask questions on the impact of smart city initiatives on inclusion and diversity in terms of urban policy making and urban social relations. We asked who participates in these initiatives and how, who is affected by them, and who is passed over. Overall, we looked at how smart city policies impact social justice, inequality, urban democracy, citizenship, and the right to the city. I'll come back to this one because it's really important for the development of this research. And then we looked also at sustainability, to what extent have smart cities been linked to ideas and goals related to sustainability, and what impact does smart city approaches have on grand environmental and social challenges. And then lastly, we looked at risk and privacy. So how are smart city initiatives justified by arguments about risk? That is, what are the risks being involved in being a dumb city, according to the smart city proponents? And do smart city policies reduce risk, or do they create new forms of fragility and systemic risk? So that was the broad themes of this project, and we hosted an international smart cities workshop, which was amazing to be in a room with a whole bunch of people. How novel does that seem? And here's some of the organizing committee. I threw this photo up purely for nostalgic purposes, just to remember those times that we sat at tables together and discussed and planned our research. We had some really fantastic talks at that session. People from all over the world came in, and we had presentations from a wide group of international attendees. On your left, that's Carla Baio, the CEO of the Center of Automotive Research, and top right is Harvey Miller, professor at Ohio State University, who talked about the US Department of Transportation Smart City Strategy from the perspective of the winning city, Columbus, Ohio. Dr. Anthony Ye is in the bottom right corner from Hong Kong University, and he talked about smart cities in Pacific Asia, the role of government and private sectors. We also had Nancy Odendell from the University of Cape Town, and looking at does the African smart city exist, and understanding the implication technology has on livelihoods in African cities. It culminated in a special issue in Urban Studies. Again, the QR code, you can scan this, and this will bring you directly to the volume of the Urban Studies Journal. In this special issue, we identified that in some cases, smart programs bring substantial benefit to those that can access them. Other smart city programs are nothing more than placebo urban interventions, highly visible initiatives that give the appearance of significant action but fail to address the most pressing urban problems, such as affordable housing and food insecurity. In other cases, and I think the most dangerous, smart city programs are not what they're marketed for, but rather serve as a Trojan horse for pursuing either more conventional or sometimes more controversial agendas. So an example of this was when a parking app might be employed by a city and used to make parking easier, but in reality, they use that to justify removing permitted parking spaces. Again, this QR code will bring you to the special issue. The introductory paper is open access. If there are other articles you're interested in but don't have access, please follow up with me, and I'm happy to help arrange that. So then more explicitly, the social justice bit of this and really exploring the social justice side of this research is what interested me the most. And so again, these are the questions that we explored. And I really got into social justice literature as it relates to technology and smart cities, and especially thanks to the lead and insight of the brilliant scholars I had an opportunity to work with, especially Dr. Gwendolyn Blue and Dr. Marit Rosal, who are full professors in the Department of Geography. So social justice is the view that everyone deserves equitable rights and opportunities unrestricted by social, economic, and cultural forces such as income, gender, race, and disability. So we explored these questions broadly. And in doing this research, we learned that smart city proponents, so both scholars and practitioners, state that the technology will X and therefore will be more just, without understanding the stage in which the struggle over social justice plays out. So it really ends up being a means to an end. We're doing this to be more socially just, but it's so necessary to understand the stage in which these struggles over social justice play out. And so we set out to understand more about social justice and how it relates to smart cities. We actually published a book chapter in German, thanks again to the lead of Dr. Marit Rosal. It's the first publication I've ever produced that I actually cannot read. But fortunately, we're given the permission to create an English version as a UC Cities working paper. And here we focus on Nancy Fraser, one of the leading social justice scholars of our time and perhaps of all time. And Fraser establishes a framework for justice that requires representation, recognition, and redistribution. But before I get into Nancy and Fraser's framework, this is a plug that in no way benefits me at all. I just loved this book. I have it right here even, Feminism for the 99%. It's a manifesto. And it was just, I would say, the most impactful thing I've read, and actually quite short in the last year. And this manifesto makes a simple but powerful case that feminism shouldn't start or stop with the drive to have women represented at the top of their profession, but instead it needs to focus on the bottom and fight for the world they deserve. Feminism must be anti-capitalist, eco-social, and anti-racist. It's essential reading for anyone who wants to understand feminism better and sometimes even rethink some of the earlier things that we were taught. Okay, so back to Fraser. This framework builds on existing notions of participation, so such as the very popular Arnstein's Ladder of Citizen Participation, which she published in 1969. And in this research, it was published in the American Journal of the American Planning Association, and this is a time when participation in planning was more important than ever, or was starting to become more important than it ever had been before. But Arnstein uses this heuristic, this ladder, to articulate both the problems and the power of participation, that it can be a form of manipulation or placation at the bottom or partway up the ladder. So a check mark for a developer saying, yes, I've talked to the community, we're good to go, we're ready to build this 22-story condo. But participation can actually be used as a mechanism for greater citizen control. So this closely aligns Sherry Arnstein's Ladder of Citizen Participation with what Nancy Fraser clarifies as representation, or describes as representation, which is really concerned with who gets a seat at the table. So referring to both membership in terms of who counts, who belongs, who's included, and who's excluded, as well as the procedures and the processes to structure inclusion or contestation. And here's where, with Dr. Blue and Dr. Rosal, we put forth the provocation that participation isn't enough for justice, that we also require recognition and redistribution when it comes to smart cities. And so redistribution refers to the economic dimension of justice in terms of class inequalities and allocations of wealth and opportunity. So more specifically, attention is drawn to the social arrangements that institutionalize deprivation, exploitation, and gross disparities in wealth, income, leisure time, thereby denying some people the means and opportunity to interact with others as peers. Recognition, which is part of this tripartite of participation, recognition directs attention towards the institutionalized patterns, structures, and policies that produce and sustain inequalities of social status. So this can be grossly simplified as identity politics, but it's far more complex than that. And in reality, overcoming structures of subordination are far more complicated. And this framework of understanding justice really helped me, or of understanding participation and a priority of participation as it relates to justice, really helped me understand the theoretical framing of justice. I worked to apply that to the digital environment. But all of this taught me it's really complicated, and there are far more perspectives out there and justice scholars other than Fraser. But I just love how she simplifies this as much as possible. And in terms of simplifying it, this is my favorite. She simplifies justice by indicating justice is in fact hard to see or understand. This was one of my favorite papers of hers on justice. So she states that justice is really hard to see and understand. It's through understanding what's unjust that we get a sense of what counts as an alternative. So now I just want to walk you through then my research and drawing on my research on accessible mobilities for people with disabilities to make those injustices became so much more obvious. And so the first example of kind of injustice in the smart city as it relates to people with disabilities is scooters, and the fact that scooters, when they first came out, blocked the sidewalk. More recently, as you can see from the photo on the left, there's specific scooter parking that the city of Calgary implemented. Interestingly, the city of Calgary is one of the most prolific users, or residents of the city of Calgary are the most prolific users of scooters anywhere over the world. When they came in hot, and they were everywhere, and they were creating such a mess for the pedestrian environment. So now we have parking spots and mechanisms to prevent dumping, that you're not actually allowed to end your trip unless you're in a designated zone. But that was an afterthought after many people with disabilities struggled with sidewalk clutter and pedestrians as well. We have a similar problem with sidewalk robots emerging. And here's a really great example of dozens, hundreds that are out there of a life-threatening encounter with AI technology. And in this case, the AI robot stopped at an intersection and was waiting to cross the other way when a woman in a wheelchair was trying to get off of the street as the light was changing, and actually couldn't get around the robot and was stuck in live traffic. And so we see this smart city technology. Yes, it might make deliveries easier, and it could be helpful, especially for people who don't drive. Let's say you can get your prescription from the local pharmacy far easier. But the other problem is that we just don't have enough sidewalk space as it is. We are fighting for and struggling for adequate pedestrian space. And here are just two of thousands of examples I have in my photos of when we're really not giving us enough pedestrian space, that cars have had the right of way for far too long. As the photo on the left says, vehicles have the right of way. And on the right, we can see that the sidewalk often has obstacles such as light posts and telephone poles, and that is often compounded with poor sidewalk condition, and then compounded even further by construction. So we just don't have enough room on the sidewalks. We've planned for cars for way too long, and now we have autonomous delivery vehicles and robots taking up that very precious space that we have. So another example, again, is mainstream navigation apps don't actually provide any support for people with disabilities. And so I'll use Google Maps as an example, but it's the same across Apple Maps, MapQuest, and Waze, that these issues persist in all of them. So using the route from Market Mall in Calgary to my office in the Earth Science building, for those of you who are at the university or perhaps other institutions, you can actually usually search the name of the building. If you just searched University of Calgary, you're going to be put in some dot somewhere in this massive campus, but you can search the actual building name. So I searched the Earth Science building, and I want to get there as a pedestrian. So I have my pedestrian directions indicated here. But as you can see, it's a nice, here's my pedestrian route, and it's a nice 25-minute walk, except for the fact that the pedestrian directions have me navigating in the middle of the road. And this happens because pedestrian directions, and you can check this in your own neighborhood, are typically derived from the road network. And the problem with them being derived by the road network is it actually doesn't give any meaningful information for a person with a disability to that a problem they might encounter, like a missing curb cut, broken sidewalks, too narrow sidewalks. We don't have any of that information embedded in this app. In addition to the fact that when you put Market Mall in, I don't know if you can see this line with the background, maybe it's better here. It's asking you to kind of arc or perhaps fly from the center of the mall to the middle of the street to start your journey. So again, this is not meaningful pedestrian directions. And if it can't consider pedestrians, then it's really not considering the needs of people with disabilities. And then this is the part that gets me the most. Then we arrive at Earth Science. So this is where our office, where the Department of Geography is located. And for those of you who know this area, this is not the way you would go into the building. This, again, looking from this view, this is telling me to go down this street and then fly to the center of the building. But what it doesn't show is that this entire area is a loading zone, and there are in fact no entry doors. There's exit only doors or garages. And so we can see from the street view that it's downhill, that there is no sidewalk, that there are no doors that you can actually get into. And I think as somebody new to campus, you'd probably be pretty intimidated walking down here, and imagine how much that would be magnified or amplified for somebody with a mobility related disability. And so and it's really unfortunate because the actual entrance is quite lovely. It's a nice wide sidewalk. It's a gentle slope. There is an automatic door to get in, but it doesn't, our navigation apps doesn't provide any level of support that way. And so forget all that. You're frustrated, you get dropped, you're in the middle of nowhere, you can't get in. So let's just call an Uber. Let's pretend they are accessible, they have accessible options, even though they don't, or at least they're not advertised. But the problem with that, again, thinking about perpetuating inequalities and exclusions, Uber requires a credit card and a smartphone, which can leave out huge portions of the population, including newcomers and low-income individuals who may not have a smartphone or a credit card. And so now that we've pondered the character of what we consider unjust, we can begin to get a sense of what would count as an alternative. Again, here's another example, a photo on the left of an inaccessible pedestrian detour that has no options for somebody who is rolling, compared to the right. And I love this example in Inglewood, which is a neighborhood in Calgary. They have a pedestrian detour, and it was actually really well done. And I loved when I came here and I saw it, I was happy to see how it was done and designed. And so I go to take a photo, and as I do, there is a parent here pushing a stroller, and their kid was in front of them and said, look, kiddo, there's a ramp for you, and was just really excited about it. So it was so neat to be able to say that. It was so neat to be able to see that. Okay, so then Fraser says, we understand injustice, we can see that, and then we can start to understand what counts as an alternative. And the alternative is justice is the overcoming of injustice, right? She quite simply states justice is the overcoming of injustice. And so in undertaking this research and reflecting on the relationship between smart cities and social justice, or thinking about what this looks like when it comes to smart city, it became very clear in doing this research that social justice scholars did not anticipate or explicitly write about the profound impact digital technologies and smart cities have on our socially just urban futures. And that's really where my CIH work came in, both the reading group and the fellowship, that I was really able to explore notions of digital justice and digital injustices. So moving to the next section of this research talk, I want to talk about who's responsible for social justice in the smart city. And so again, drawing on Fraser, I'm such a fan. If I ever meet her, I'm just going to totally melt. She's so academic famous that I hope one day I do. But I feel like I know her from all the things that I read. And so when Fraser was writing about social justice in the context of globalization, she set up a distinctive shape to arguments about social justice that interrogates who's responsible for claims of injustice. And so paralleling Fraser's assertion that globalization is changing the way we argue about justice, I also assert that the digital is also changing the way we argue about justice. And so Fraser states that with globalization, claims for justice, who's responsible, shifted from the modern territorial state to corporations and transnational agencies. So globalization put less emphasis on states and more emphasis on corporations. Similarly, smart city technologies that are increasingly controlling aspects of civic life are not locatable within the jurisdiction of civic society or the state alone. And so the smart city movement asks new questions about the role of private actors in urban governance. And so smart technology providers, because of their unique position, influence policymaking through their products and services. Yet the effect of the role, this role on public value remains unaddressed. And a really great example of kind of what the role of these private corporations are is the Google, which is Alphabet, is the parent company of Google, Sidewalk Lab in Toronto, where they tried to revitalize the Toronto waterfront. But essentially, a lot of people pushed back against it, saying that city services are not for sale. And there were big issues about data, who owns the data, setting up a data trust, but who has that data? Because this would be a smart city that just streams an incredible amount of information. There's so much news and so much literature on this, and it's really covered heavily in the smart city sphere. And a lot of smart city scholars and advocates actually took the fact that this project failed as a success. So it was set up and it was in the works for a couple years, but there was so much resistance. When the pandemic hit, Google ended up pulling out. But the questions remain, are city services for sale, and who owns them? Who does it go to? And the data streams is just one small example of many of the issues that the Toronto Waterfront or Sidewalk Labs brought up. So that's the private corporation side of this. Now, adding to this, who's responsible changes again when we consider digital technologies within a smart city framework. And so the introduction of the city in smart cities manifests civic and state responsibility that's not present when we focus singularly on digital technologies. So if I was talking just about technology and the implication of technology, I think who's responsible is very different than when we put it in a smart city framework and we put some state and municipal responsibility there. So dozens of nation states, so you're wondering it's a smart city, but what do nations have to do with this? Dozens of nation states all over the world have deployed smart initiatives, including the US Department of Transportation Smart City Challenge, the Infrastructure Canada Smart City Challenge, and India's 100 Smart Cities, just to name a few. And so these high-level federal policy directives are guiding municipalities and cities and townships to be smart and putting a large prize prize on it, upwards of millions and tens to hundreds of millions of dollars to be the smartest city. But it's within the cities that smart actually plays out. And so putting the who's responsible on cities renders visible the political and institutional arena to make claims for justice. However, this is a big responsibility for civic society, especially when officials are bombarded with tech-centric solutions, but often lack any training in critical data or science and technology studies. And so somebody who's gone to school for urban planning might not be ready to vet, understand, think critically about technology that the city is considering adopting. Right, so we've covered big businesses, we've covered nation states and cities, but another complication of who's responsible for making claims of injustice is the growing manifestation of smart citizen. And there are now hundreds of papers on smart citizens. The growing body of literature critical of tech platforms and data-driven smart cities are advocating for citizen-centric smart cities and community-engaged digital governance. But conceptualizing smart cities then puts the onus on who's responsible for ensuring just and equitable outcomes on the ordinary citizen. But does the smart citizen, in fact, embody everyday struggles facing citizens and that of citizens of the greatest need? And I think a really great example of this is Strava. This is the #1 app for runners and cyclists. So people use this to track their runs, to track their rides. You can compete with other people and you can compete with yourself. And it's an example of a smart city technology that has implications on social justice. So if we use Strava, this is what we see, right? We see our distance and how far we went and how fast we went, and we can see how that's plotted out on a map. But this is what Strava sees. And so they get over 1.3 million posts of activities per day. And so these data are shared, are fed into Strava's Metro business, which sells anonymized computer data to cities. And I have problems with the fact that they sell this data. And I think that's problematic on its own, because now cities are in a position where they feel like they have more data than ever on cycling and pedestrian movement, on cyclists and pedestrians, but it's from a very segmented portion of the population. When we think about it, it's not the kids taking a stroll around the neighborhood or the seniors going out for a healthy stroll or perhaps even to go get groceries. But it's really the people who are more likely to be, competitive with themselves, competitive with others. The demographics show that their people are often in their 20s and 30s. And so there's a huge issue when cities all of a sudden see more data than they've ever had, right? It complements what they've traditionally done, which you have a survey on the street and somebody quite literally stares there all day and checks who's coming by on certain intersections. It's a very analog way to understand how people are interacting with the urban environment and what modes of transit they're using. But Strava, now we have, we've gone from thousands of data points from this analog data collection to millions of data points. It would really take a city to be able to think critically and understand that they are seeing more data than ever, but these data are excluding more people than ever. But that's not even the most problematic issue with Strava. That's not even the worst part. The app gave away the location of secret US Army bases. So people were running, there's multiple articles, I put quite a few links there if you want to look into this. But people on these Army bases were running and staying fit and healthy and using their Strava app to keep track of that. And what happened is that they ended up mapping the location and even the kind of outline of these bases based on the activity of the people. So again, I put out the provocation: who's responsible for this? Is it the runners who are responsible? In fact, yes, that's the case. Here's Strava's privacy policy, and I'll throw that out to the participants here. I mean, how many of you have read the terms of service the last time you downloaded an app? Often those there is some sort of responsibility that you're taking on by downloading it and using the app. So maybe in part, but is it also the sergeant in command, right? Or should it be the Army and their policies on technology use? Or is it Strava? So who's responsible gets very complicated when we consider the smart city. On top of that, we can't forget about the massive responsibility on researchers and research teams, both academic and NGO, that are developing, implementing, and studying smart city technologies. Their work informs all levels of government, businesses, and decision makers on the appropriate and suitable implementation of emerging technologies. And so in the process of really getting deep in studying social justice in the smart city, it became very clear that we urgently need better representation in humanities and social science scholars on these data and technology-driven projects, and better engagement with the populations being affected by the technology being developed. Often that's the skills of computer scientists and programmers who can develop some of these technologies, but they have very real implications on the lives of citizens and some of the most vulnerable users in our city. So the intersection between corporate, state, civic, citizen, and professional responsibility complicates who's responsible. And that in turn further problematizes the political, societal, economic, cultural arrangements that redress digital justice. So this intersection is unique and it's complex. And this intricate web of who's responsible is just one example of the range of complexities for social justice and the smart city. And so I just want to shift now just to talk about the ongoing research and the volume in digital justice. A lot of this work was supported, or given the complexity of social justice in the smart cities, we are now in the 5th installation of our working group on social justice, or social justice in the smart city. We've had some amazing conversations. Our reading lists are awesome. I'm actually hoping to put them together from the last 5 years and then post it on the website, because we haven't done that yet. And we've had great speakers. One of my favorite one is Gillian Rose from the University of Oxford, who talked about data bodies, smart bodies, and sensible bodies. That's available as a live stream on the UC Cities website and easily accessible by this QR code if you scan it with your camera. In our we focused, again, explicitly on mapping and mapping injustices in the smart cities. And we questioned the spaces of injustice, what it meant, what did social justice mean when it came to the smart city, and the relationship between digital urban space and the concept of smart cities. So it led to an edited volume on digital injustice in the smart city. And this volume edited by Dr. Deborah McKinnon, Dr. Ryan Burns, and myself. Dr. McKinnon was a postdoc here and is now a tenure track professor at Lakehead. Dr. Ryan Burns is a professor in geography, and myself. It's under contract with University of Toronto Press. And here we dedicated making space for arguments about social justice within the smart city. And this volume really enters into longstanding and diverse discussions on justice as it relates to the imbrications of technology and the urban fabric. So the book provides a venue for bringing together smart city and social justice discussions occurring across a range of geographic contexts and disciplines: geography, urban studies, urban planning, sociology, communications, digital humanities, information technology, science and technology, public policy, among others, to really get a deeper understanding of the scope and magnitude of the inequities that exist within smart cities. And so this book is organized into 5 sections and drawing on inspiration from well-established traditions of dialogue in order to generate deeper insight. Each section of the book starts with a conversation with a leading scholar in the field. And so the first section is challenging the foundation of SMART, which explores the ideologies and assumptions that predate and underpin smart city development and establishes conceptual foundations for a new smart city research agenda that focuses on feminist, queer, and more than human diffractions of digital justice. And here we dialogue with Stephen Graham. The next section is on data decisioning and data justice, where we analyze the logics, rationalities, governance, and creation of urban data specifically. We build on critical data studies and data justice, and the authors in the section identify injustice with data-based and socio-technical approaches. And here we spoke to Rob Kitchen about data justice. Next, we looked at infrastructures of injustice, where we spoke to Vincent Moscow, and this section offers empirical case studies of smart cities ranging from prototypes to actually existing ones from both the global north and south. The contributions foreground the uneven, granular, and scalar context of smart cities and the unjust potentials and capacities. Next was complicated and complicating digital divides, which challenges and updates longstanding discussions on digital divide in order to examine the landscapes of inequality and injustice. Again, chapters in this section refuse to take for granted what work the digital divide has done for us, and instead uses the lens of the digital to think about social, political, and economic inequalities across the spectrum. And it's really interesting in this work to see the digital divide changing. A lot of people think the digital divide is just about access to computers, and now that we have smartphone and Wi-Fi networks, that the digital divide has gone away. And it hasn't gone away. The Strava example shows that. It's just more complicated and requires more critical thinking to reveal these inequalities. And then the last section is on urban citizenship and participation, and that explores the political geographies of digital injustice and focuses on classic themes of citizenship, belonging, community, and the public sphere. Continuing this work, this research is ongoing, and we aim to understand the diverse ways in which SMART is playing out in different contexts. This is kind of the next iteration of this project and some of the preliminary learning from these different, so it's a partnership development grant where we're working with partners all across the world, from Canada as well as Singapore, South Korea, Spain, Sweden, and Taiwan, to understand how their smart cities are actually unfolding there. We're getting a look behind the curtain, and there's so much to learn, and there's so much more research to come in this area. But in the meantime, I just want to say our CIH working group is still active, and we welcome new participants. If you want to be part of these conversations, you're welcome to join the UC Cities listserv to keep up to date. Again, this QR code you can use to sign up for that listserv. There's so much more I want to say, but I'm right at my 45-minute mark, so I'll cut it off. But the last thing I do want to say is a genuine thank you to colleagues, collaborators, and especially students on this project who really together create a great learning environment, and the CIH as well for providing that engaging and learning environment to pursue this work. So thanks so much, CIH.
Well, thank you, Victoria, for a fascinating and very wide-ranging talk. It's hard to think about where to start to ask a question about that. I do want to encourage people, if you have a question, to put it in the Q&A, and I can relay them to Victoria. I wanted to start out with a question of a very practical one. It seems, with cities is where we really hit politics at the very granular level in some ways. And the whole issue of smart cities does bring up questions of participation, representation, and so on. And for me, there's a very practical example of my neighbor Nova, who turned 76 yesterday. Happy birthday, Nova. She does not have a computer or a printer or a smartphone. And so I first became aware of this when the whole parking system changed in Calgary. And she could no longer have visitor parking because she couldn't register a visitor on the computer, which is how you do that if you've got residential parking. So I called up the city and they said, well, she can write a letter if she has a guest coming, or phone us at this number, which is just, a little bit of a nonsense. The next issue, bigger lately, there's been a lot of these issues, is of course, the COVID passport. So first of all, getting it, we had to get it for her, printed out. We don't have a printer either. Those stupid cards are not card sized. And I fear what happens when it's all a QR code, because she doesn't have a cell phone to present a QR code with, so that her data can be scanned. And that actually could cause very large problems of accessibility for particular kinds of venues, traveling, especially if airlines decide they will not use the very falsifiable printable card, but want to see a QR code. So how are we to think about the case of a person like Nova, who is never going to have a cell phone, as far as I can tell, or a computer? I'm happy to do this work for her. But not only is she not able to access a lot of things now, she also, of course, because of the representation of data that flows out of these systems, is completely unrepresented to city planners, as well as, of course, larger planners. So there's one kind of granular example for you.
Yeah, well, happy birthday, Nova. And congratulations, Nova, for having an amazing neighbor. Congratulations, Jim, for being an amazing neighbor, because this is such a common problem. And this is a really important group of people who are excluded from this transition from analog to digital. And part of my early exploration in this is, does social justice mean providing these analog options? So just for context for the people here, initially, before it was the digital parking pass, people in these people who lived in these kind of, desirable parking areas were just given a pass every year, and you could hand that to your guest. So again, the issue is if you have people coming in, let's say you have a social worker coming in or a nurse coming in, that you just want to hand them the pass. It's not feasible to go in online every time and to write that in. And so, are there analog solutions? And if we maintain some sort of analog solution, so a paper solution for certain people, is that a component of a more socially just smart city? But we're not seeing these analog alternatives. They're not there. They're not possible in some instances. Like you said, for COVID, right? The cards could be so easily falsifiable that we need QR codes. And here I am, a proponent of all this. My presentation's all full of QR codes. I realize I'm also maybe part of the problem in some instances. But I think that analog alternative is really important, and to consider keeping that if possible, but thinking about the processes of the city. They're doing it to simplify and to get rid of this other way that it's hard for them to have both. So it's actually a really challenging to provide those options. And you can think of other solutions for that. Maybe, there's a tech program for seniors, and they offer free programming and free whatever to bring down that digital divide, that more people are involved in that. But I know my mom, she just had her 75th birthday, and there is no chance that she wants to adopt any of this. So yeah, it's a tough answer. There's not an easy one.
Right. I guess, we've seen in India development of very cheap technologies, very cheap computers and things like that. Perhaps that's, a very cheap QR code reader that's just a dedicated reader might be useful for somebody like Nova. Annette Tim in the Q&A says, thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I'm also a Nancy Fraser fan. In her book, Unruly Practices, she outlines the conflict between the concept of needs and the concept of rights, and argues for, in quotes, translating justified needs claims into social right. In our society, writes Annette, the rights of car owners have trumped the rights of pedestrians, partly because people who walk are seen as poor. They have needs rather than rights, which are reserved for those with the means to lobby city governments. How do we change this?
A fascinating point. Thanks for bringing that up, Annette. And actually, there's a lot of literature on the right to the smart city. And there's so much I wanted to bring up, and there's so much literature that we've engaged with over the fellowship and also over 5 years of the CIH working group. And that I wish I can kind of include it all, but I tried to simplify it as much as possible, that we are thinking about kind of the right to the smart city now as well. And so balancing people's needs with rights is certainly an issue right at the forefront of this literature.
Thanks. An anonymous attendee asks, is there somewhere we can watch this later? Yes, this will become available, this talk, on the CIH's website. So you can go to that. We're part of the University of Calgary.
Well, thanks so much, anonymous attendee. I appreciate hearing your clapping. I miss the feedback I get from audiences, because normally, you know, especially I lecture all the time, and students will either nod and be like, I get this, or they'll give me the like, well, rewind a little bit. And so I don't have that feedback. But I've had what is it, 18 months to try to figure it out.
Right. Monique Nessett says, the city of Calgary is undertaking some dedicated work on digital equity. How can we work together to leverage your insights as we are planning a strategy?
Yes, I heard about that. Barry shared that information with me, and I am so delighted to hear that there is a digital equity strategy, and that is so important. I think that's the most important thing we can do, is make these conversations explicit. People in cities, city planners, transportation developers, the whole kind of gamut of people have not been trained in this, right? You went to school to be a transportation planner or an urban planner, and this wasn't as integrated into the curriculum and practiced on a regular basis, that we really need to put digital equity on the forefront and think about it and have the conversations. Because, you know, similar tonight, you know, Jim came up with a great idea. You know, you don't need a smartphone, you just need a really simple QR scanner, right? And sometimes the answer could be really simple.
Linda Dirksen writes, thank you for such an interesting talk. What's your advice for ordinary citizens, in quotation marks, in understanding what is happening with regard to smart technology in their own community?
Whoa, that is a fantastic question. Well, first of all, read the terms of service of your apps. I do that with all of my classes. We do an app checkup in every class. I make students go through and check their apps and read the terms of services, because some of the things you're signing up for and agreeing are not what you expect at all. And Strava is a really great example for that. In terms of smart technology in their own communities, you know, check to see if there's a digital equity strategy and see what that is. And if not, advocate for one.
Is there a way you can tell if your community is there aggregated data being collected in your particular community? Or is that just generally the apps from our phones suck it all up into a giant place and then distribute it back down?
Yeah, it sucks it up, and then, well, and cities adopt it too. And when we think about the smart city strategy, that was a federal initiative through Infrastructure Canada. And so the federal government said, your priority is to be smart, and we are going to give you millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to be smart. And so cities all of a sudden turn to like, okay, we're going to be smart. And that was the adoption of technology. And now I think in this kind of, now we've had a time to stop and think about it. We're saying, okay, now we really need to think about digital equity and digital justice as well.
There's another question here about a different class of citizen. Another anonymous attendee, thanks you again for the talk, but asks about children. How do smart city planners account for small children? You spoke earlier about accessibility, but as I realized, Uber, for instance, is only for adults, since there's no way of using an Uber with a child who needs a car seat. But children are also a special case, that they're not enfranchised citizens either, with no particular rights of their own.
Yeah, we are seeing them being left out over and over. And there was one case in Ontario, I think it was the town of Aurora. I hope I have that name right, was getting to the point where they were expanding and needing some sort of public transit, but public transit seemed so expensive. So instead they adopted Uber, and they gave people Uber credits, which again, you know, having a bus show up that, you know, you can train I don't know how young they could go, maybe 10, 11, 12, they can learn to take the bus, but they're not calling an Uber. And you're not bringing a stroller or a car seat into an Uber. That buses provide that services. So cities really need to think not about these kind of individualized, privatized services, but what is for the greater good of everybody. And there's a warning in there as well about autonomous vehicles, because we're moving the same way. We've made so much progress on active transit and transit infrastructure. The city of Calgary has the most amazing C train and bus network. But when autonomous vehicles come in, again, it's prioritizing privatized transportation options. And that when those actually become viable, they will have a huge implication on cities for the worse. And I think planners and cities need to be on top of that to make sure that their transit remains viable and a good option, and integrating into potential an autonomous future rather than being in competition with it.
I recall one of the objections to Uber and other ride sharing companies was that taxis, which are municipally licensed, were required to go into any area and pick up anyone, or the company could lose its license. This was not the case with Uber. There's no particular requirement for them to have accessible vehicles, and there's no particular requirement, as far as I know, for them not to essentially redline communities and decide not to go there, whereas taxis have to. So there's another example, I think, of a social justice question that intersects with a technology question, where, of course, Uber is fast and quick, and well, it's fast and quick as long as you have a smartphone and you live in the right area and you have mobility and you're not a child.
Yeah. And don't forget about the rating system too. So when you go to Uber, you get rated. And if you get rated down, that often drivers won't pick you up. When you go to call an Uber, they can see what rating you have. I mean, this isn't a full-blown social credit score, but it's certainly dipping our toes into one. And I know people who, left the hospital and got a ride, and then, they were medicated. They had some things going on, and so they get in the car and they're not quite okay, but they're getting home and they're going to recover. And they got rated down quite significantly. And having a 0 rating out of 5 or 1 star or whatever it is really brings your average down, and drivers won't pick you up. Drivers will look and be like, "Whoa, this person's got a 4 out of 5 stars or a 3 out of 5 stars. I'm not going there." So it's a slippery slope.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Finally, anonymous attendee says, again, thanks for the talk. In advocacy and mobility spaces, we often speak of the need for representation. However, there is also often resistance to equity narratives. This means for the underrepresented in the city, we must speak in the language and in the terms of those with power. Could you provide your thoughts on this tension?
Okay, so representation, but the resistance to the equity narrative. I mean, isn't that the challenge for so many things, right? Cities are dealing with how to, speak to citizens. Citizens are learning how to speak to cities. And fortunately, well, this goes back to, I think, Arnstein's ladder of citizen engagement, that we really need to prioritize engagement. And that's something that the city of Calgary does really well. They have an engagement strategy. They have an engagement group. They have some really great tools for that. But it's creating those open lines of communication as openly and effectively as possible, trying to get rid of jargon. I know one of the counselors put forward the simple language. I'm getting it wrong, but the simple language, I don't speak politics that well, as you can tell. It was something that required everything to have simple language. And there were some really profound examples of how the language was so complex and inaccessible to the average citizen. And so it's using that simple language and also creating that environment for meaningful engagement.
That links to some of the there are a number of people in the chat, and perhaps we'll make sure that these get relayed to you, have asked about further information and how to get further information. So and also specifically about whether you have written on a particular topic. But Linda Dirksen writes, I live in a city of about 100,000 people, and they are enthusiastically embracing smart technology. I sit on the city committee on access and inclusion. Can you point me to any resources that could help me to explain to these people the issues that you have raised here? I know with certainty that most city councillors will not understand many of these issues. Or perhaps that is a request for a knowledge translation piece that is specifically directed at cities and citizens. I'm so glad to see this kind of question. This is something that the Calgary Institute for the Humanities cares a great deal about, which is translating the work that happens at the universities into usable knowledge for citizens and the various other communities we serve. Do you have suggestions for where people can go for further resources, non-specialized, perhaps non-academic resources for understanding the implications of the smart city, particularly with respect to social justice?
Yeah, I'd need to look, maybe that's the next fellowship, Jim, on knowledge mobilization.
Yes.
I actually really appreciate, as a data scientist who deals with these large data flows and spatial analytics, to create this space and through the CIH to have these conversations about social justice, which I've never been in my research program before I joined the University of Calgary. So thanks so much for making that space. And I think we need to work better on that knowledge mobilization to influence communities more broadly. But I can look for some resources. There's none that I can list off the top of my head. I'm sure there's a couple there, but they're a little buried right now. But follow up, and I would be happy to have a conversation. My email is really simple. It's victoria.fast@ucalgary.ca.
Mm-hmm. You could also, I would suggest, if people are interested, you can go to the CIH's website and look at the working groups, and you'll see contact information for the social justice and the smart city working group, the emails of the conveners, and you could perhaps, well, Victoria is one of the conveners, you could fire off an email to them as well, and they might perhaps be able to, fire that around to the group and see if anyone else has suggestions on particular particular issues, if there's things that have been written about that. And finally, just one quick question. What are your thoughts on scooters on campus? Since you brought that up early on.
You know what? My issue with scooters is there's no helmets, and like, you are the most vulnerable user at that point, and people are just going so fast on them that I want to see people wearing helmets with this. And I actually saw some new scooters downtown just not that long ago that actually had helmets mounted right on them, which was awesome. Except the people I know who ride scooters refuse to wear them because they think, they don't want to wear somebody else's helmet. So I haven't thought about it so much on campus. I mean, it's nice to have other mobility options, and this is getting into micro mobility. And, maybe somebody would be less inclined to bring their car if they know they can connect easily with a scooter. So I think it's great. But with all of these technologies, I think there's a big asterisk. We need to stop. We need to think about it. One of the things the city of Calgary did, in addition to putting parking zones and not allowing people to dump their scooters anywhere that you have to be to a designated zone before you can end your trip, they also have it slowing down in high traffic areas. So let's have scooters on campus if people want that. But I think we need to be really thoughtful about where they get parked and how fast they go, and limiting that in that really kind of dense pedestrian campus environment.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it brings up the issue that a lot of some of the problems that arise from technology can actually be mitigated with technology. So making a smart scooter even smarter to slow down, or not to go if your helmet's not on, or something like that. Well, I think at this point we've run out of time, but I want to thank Dr. Fast for this great presentation, and for letting us into both her own work, but also the work of this working group. I would once again encourage you to get in touch with the working group. It is an open group, and they do talks throughout the year on topics around this that you may well want to come to, either virtually or perhaps someday even in person. But thanks again for this talk. Thanks to Sean Lindsay again for the technical support that he offered. Happy birthday, Sean. And also thanks to all of you for showing up virtually. We do hope one day to see you all in person at a CIH event.
Me too. Thanks so much for inviting me, Jim, and thanks so much for creating the space for this type of research.
Our pleasure. Good night, everyone.